My friends, before we say anything about God, before we speak of Christ, before we even attempt to understand spiritual truth, let us be still for a moment, not as a technique, not as a discipline, but simply as a willingness to stop struggling, because there is a struggle that almost every sincere seeker carries, and most are not even aware of it. It is the quiet strain of trying to become spiritual. You see, many of us have come to this teaching weary, not weary of life alone, but weary of effort, spiritual effort. We have prayed, studied, affirmed, denied, disciplined the mind, watched our thoughts, corrected our attitudes, and still there lingers a subtle sense that something is missing. We do not often say it aloud, but it is there. Why am I still striving if God is present? Why am I still seeking if Christ is within? The human mind has been trained to believe that spirituality is an attainment, that one day, through enough understanding, enough right living, enough prayer, we shall arrive at a place where peace abides permanently. And so the search continues, the effort continues, the self-improvement continues. Yet the Master never said, strive to enter the kingdom. He said, the kingdom of God is within you. Not will be, not shall come, is. There is a deep irony here that we must face gently, without condemnation. The very effort to become spiritual is the activity of the self that believes it is separate from God, and every attempt to improve that self only strengthens the illusion that it exists apart from divine life. Scripture tells us plainly, I can of mine own self do nothing. Yet we spend years trying to do something with the self that can do nothing. Let us be honest for a moment. How many prayers are offered from a sense of lack? How many meditations are entered with an unspoken hope that something will happen, something will change, something will finally arrive? But God is not an event. Christ is not an experience to be achieved. The presence does not come and go. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. Not tomorrow, not after preparation. Now, the hidden struggle of the spiritual seeker is this, the belief that God is absent until proven present. And so prayer becomes an effort to reach God rather than a resting in God. Meditation becomes a means to contact God rather than the quiet recognition that there is no place where God is not. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? There is no answer to that question because there is nowhere to go. In our classes over the years, I have watched sincere students exhaust themselves spiritually. They are doing everything they know to do, and that is precisely the problem. The doing never ends until the doing self is seen for what it is, a mistaken sense of identity. When the Master said, take no thought for your life, he was not offering advice for better living. He was pointing to the end of the struggler. There is a point in spiritual unfoldment where one must dare to stop. Stop trying to heal spiritually. Stop trying to become illumined. Stop trying to demonstrate truth. And this stopping is not neglect, it is surrender. It is the moment when the soul says, if God is God, then God must be present where I am. Be still and know that I am God. Not think, not believe, know. This is why the weary seeker is often closer to realization than the enthusiastic beginner. When the effort has worn itself out, when the mind can no longer push forward, something else begins to take over. Grace, revelation, the gentle awareness that the presence has never been absent. Lo, I am with you always, not after you succeed, not after you improve, always. So let us begin here, not with striving, not with correction, not with intention, but with recognition. Recognition that the struggle itself is not spiritual. Recognition that the Christ does not arrive at the end of effort, but at the end of effortlessness. Recognition that what you are seeking has never been outside of you, never withheld, never delayed. If there is anything required of us at this moment, it is not effort, but honesty. The honesty to admit that the personal self has been trying to do what only God can be, and the humility to let that self rest, not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord. This, then, is our beginning, not a beginning of action, but a beginning of stillness. And in that stillness, we do not wait for God. We discover that God is already here. Now let us look gently, without resistance, at the assumption that lies beneath nearly all religious practice and much metaphysical work. The belief that God is not yet here. It is rarely stated so plainly, but it governs prayers, disciplines, sacrifices, and even spiritual devotion. It is the belief that God is somewhere else, and that through right action, right thinking, or right believing, we may persuade God to draw near. This assumption is ancient, and it is human. From the earliest days, humanity has looked toward mountains, temples, heavens, holy cities, sacred persons, and future times, believing that God must be contacted there. Yet the revelation of Scripture moves in the opposite direction. When Moses asked for God's name, the answer was not a location, not a description, not a condition. It was simply, I am. Not I will be, not I shall come, I am. When we assume that God is absent, prayer becomes a request, meditation becomes a reaching, worship becomes an attempt to please, and slowly, subtly, the soul is trained to believe that it stands outside the presence it longs for. This is the great inversion. Instead of realizing that man exists in God, God is imagined as existing apart from man. Even the sincere declaration, I am seeking God, carries within it a confession of separation. For who is the one seeking, and where is the God being sought? Yet the Master revealed a truth so simple that it escaped religious systems for centuries. The Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works, not visits, not assists, dwelleth. We must understand this clearly. God is not nearer to the saint than to the sinner. God is not more present in prayer than in silence. God is not closer in healing than in illness. Omnipresence does not fluctuate according to our awareness of it. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. This is not poetry, it is law. The belief that God must be reached is what produces spiritual anxiety. It causes people to measure themselves constantly. Am I praying enough? Am I living rightly? Do I understand sufficiently? And all of this measuring is the activity of the personal sense of self trying to secure divine approval. But God does not approve, disapprove, reward, or punish. God is. You see, the moment you assume God is absent, you have already created distance. And distance is the illusion that sustains fear, effort, and delay. This is why so many prayers feel unanswered. Not because God is silent, but because the prayer itself begins from a false premise. Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear. How could this be so, unless presence is already established? There comes a moment in spiritual maturity when one must dare to reverse this assumption entirely. Instead of asking, How do I reach God? The question becomes, why do I believe God is not already here? And when this question is honestly faced, without argument, without theology, something in consciousness begins to yield. We discover that the sense of absence was never divine, it was mental. It was a habit of thought inherited from generations who lived under law instead of grace, under effort instead of revelation, under fear instead of knowing. But grace does not come to us. Grace is the nature of being. My grace is sufficient for thee, not will be, is. When this false assumption begins to dissolve, prayer undergoes a transformation. It is no longer a plea. It is no longer a negotiation. It becomes communion, quiet awareness, a resting in the fact of presence. And in that resting, something remarkable happens. The need to speak diminishes. The need to ask fades. The soul begins to listen. This is why the deepest prayer is often wordless, not because words are wrong, but because truth does not need persuasion. God does not need to be convinced. God does not need to be informed. God does not need to be moved. I know the things ye have need of before ye ask. So, if God is not absent, and if God does not need to be reached, then what remains? What remains is recognition. Recognition that the presence is already established. Recognition that the life you are seeking is the life that is living you. Recognition that the Christ is not coming but revealing itself as your true being. This realization does not come through intensity. It comes through surrender, through the quiet abandonment of the belief that something is missing. When that belief falls away, even momentarily, the soul touches rest. And in that rest, truth speaks, not audibly, but unmistakably. And so we move now naturally from this false assumption into the heart of the teaching itself, not Christ as an object of faith, but Christ as identity. Now we come to the place where words become inadequate, and yet words must be used not to define truth, but to remove what is untrue. For the moment we say Christ within, the human mind wants to make of Christ something to acquire, something to experience, something that arrives at a high point of spiritual development. But Christ is not an attainment. Christ is not a reward. Christ is not the end of a journey. Christ is the revelation of what already is. The great mistake of religion has been to turn Christ into a person to be worshipped, admired, or imitated, rather than a consciousness to be realized. Yet the Master never pointed to himself as separate. He said, I and the Father are one, and then immediately extended that truth, that they all may be one, as thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee. This was not special privilege. This was universal identity. Christ is not Jesus' last name. Christ is the divine awareness that Jesus lived from. It is the recognition of God as individual being, not God visiting man, but God appearing as man. And until this is understood, spirituality remains something we do rather than something we are. We must be very clear here. Christ within does not mean a divine companion living alongside a human self. There are not two of you, one human struggling and one Christ helping. That is duality. Christ within means that the very sense of I, which you have always assumed to be personal, is, in truth, divine. Before Abraham was, I am. Not I was, I am. This is why the spiritual path feels confusing at times. We are trying to improve the person, while truth is trying to reveal that the person was never the source. The personal sense of self wants Christ to come and fix it, guide it, heal it, prosper it. But Christ does not improve the human. It replaces the belief that the human is the doer. When Paul said, "I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me," he was not speaking metaphorically. He was describing a literal shift of identity, the end of personal authorship, the end of self-direction, the end of the belief that life originates in a private mind. And this shift does not occur through discipline, it occurs through revelation. Many ask, how do I live from Christ? But that question still assumes separation. You do not live from Christ as one lives from a source outside oneself. You live as Christ when the false sense of identity dissolves. And that dissolution is not dramatic. It is often quiet, subtle, almost unnoticed until peace begins to take the place of striving. This is why Jesus said, "Except ye become as a little child, ye shall not enter the kingdom of heaven." A child does not manage life. A child does not plan existence. A child does not carry the burden of authorship. A child lives from trust. And trust is the natural state of Christ consciousness. Let us remove another misconception. Christ consciousness is not moral perfection. It is not the absence of mistakes. It is not a personality change. It is the awareness that life is living itself through you. That intelligence is functioning without personal effort. That supply, harmony, guidance, and order are not created by thought but revealed by alignment. When this identity begins to dawn, prayer changes again. You no longer pray to God. You pray as awareness. Sometimes there are no words at all, only a quiet recognition. Father, thou art here. And in that recognition, the sense of separation dissolves, and with it goes fear. This is why fear cannot coexist with Christ consciousness. Fear depends on the belief that life is personal, fragile, and vulnerable. Christ consciousness reveals life as eternal, impersonal, and governed by divine law. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Not because I am good, not because I am worthy, but because I am not separate from the shepherd. Once Christ is understood as identity rather than objective, the endless spiritual chase comes to an end. You stop looking for signs. You stop asking for confirmation. You stop measuring progress. You begin to rest, and in that rest, life reorganizes itself, not dramatically, but divinely. So, we are not speaking here of becoming something new. We are speaking of remembering what has always been true. The Christ within has never been dormant. It has never been absent. It has never been withheld. It has only been overlooked by the belief in a personal self that needed improvement. And now, having seen Christ as present identity, we must face the next great illusion, one that keeps this realization from becoming practical. The belief that effort is still required to make truth work. At this point in our unfolding, we must face a truth that the human mind resists with great subtlety. Spiritual effort does not bring spiritual realization. In fact, beyond a certain stage, it delays it. This does not mean that study, prayer, or meditation were mistakes. They were necessary steps. But every step has an ending, and effort must eventually give way to awareness. The personal sense of self believes that effort is noble. It says, if I try harder, I will be better. If I discipline myself more, I will be closer to God. Yet this very effort assumes that the self is the doer, and the moment the self assumes authorship, it has already moved away from truth. Scripture does not say, by your effort shall ye be saved. It says, by grace are ye saved. Grace cannot be earned. Grace cannot be forced. Grace cannot be improved upon. Grace is the nature of reality itself. And when we strive spiritually, we are unknowingly saying, grace is not enough. God must be helped. This is not rebellion, it is ignorance. But ignorance has consequences. Even when sincere, let us be very clear. Effort belongs to the realm of the human mind. It is useful for learning skills, building structures, and organizing human affairs. But spiritual realization does not come from construction, it comes from removal. The removal of false beliefs, the removal of self-direction, the removal of the idea that you are managing life. Jesus never healed through effort. He never strained to overcome disease. He never fought error. He simply stood in recognition. When he said, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me, and I knew that thou hearest me always, there was no effort in that prayer. There was certainty, recognition, rest. Spiritual effort backfires because it strengthens the very self that must be surrendered. The one who is trying to become Christ-aware is the one who believes he is not. And so the cycle continues. Effort produces frustration, frustration produces more effort, and soon the spiritual path becomes another burden. This is why many reach a point of exhaustion and say, I have done everything I know, and that moment, though painful, is often the doorway, because when there is nothing left to do, something else begins to function. Be still and know that I am God. Stillness is not laziness. It is the cessation of false activity. The ego fears this. It says, if I stop trying, everything will collapse. But what collapses is not life. It is the illusion of control. And that illusion has been heavy. It has been exhausting. It has never truly worked. Christ consciousness does not require effort because Christ consciousness is life aware of itself. You may ask, then what do I do? And the answer is unsettling to the human mind. Nothing except stop interfering. Stop correcting yourself spiritually. Stop measuring your awareness. Stop trying to feel something happen. God is not an experience to be generated. God is the ground of being. This does not mean we abandon integrity or love or wisdom. It means we stop trying to produce them personally. The fruit of the Spirit is not manufactured. It grows naturally when the soil is undisturbed. Love, peace, patience, gentleness. These are not achievements. They are effects of alignment. There is a moment when one must trust God enough to let go of effort. Not recklessly, not dramatically, but inwardly. A letting go of spiritual ambition. A willingness to be nothing so that God may be everything. He must increase, but I must decrease. This is not humility as behavior. This is humility as realization. And when effort falls away, you do not become inactive. Life continues often more efficiently, more harmoniously, more intelligently. Decisions arise without strain. Guidance appears without seeking. Supply unfolds without manipulation. Not because you have learned a better method, but because you are no longer blocking the flow. So we see now that effort was never the key. Effort was a stage, necessary for a time, but not permanent. And now, having seen the futility of striving, we are ready for the next movement of consciousness, not trying to surrender, but allowing surrender to occur. There comes a moment in the life of every sincere student when the desire to improve oneself spiritually must give way to something far deeper, the willingness to yield. This yielding is not an action you perform. It is not a discipline you practice. It is the natural consequence of seeing that the personal self has never been the source of life, wisdom, or power. Improvement belongs to the human sense of existence. It assumes that man is unfinished, incomplete, and in need of refinement. But surrender belongs to spiritual realization. It begins with the quiet acknowledgement, I was never meant to run this life. And when that acknowledgement dawns, not intellectually, but inwardly, there is a release that no effort could ever produce. Most people misunderstand surrender. They believe it means resignation, passivity, or giving up responsibility. But true surrender is none of these. True surrender is the end of resistance to what already is. It is the moment when the soul stops arguing with reality. Thy will be done. Not as a plea, but as a recognition that divine will is already functioning. The personal sense of self wants to cooperate with God. It wants to help God by being better, purer, wiser. But God does not need cooperation. God needs receptivity. And receptivity is not something you do. It is something you allow when you stop interfering. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Notice that salvation is not something you produce. It is something you witness. Yielding is the inner act of stepping aside, not dramatically, not emotionally, but quietly. It is the realization that the mind which has been planning, correcting, judging, and managing is not the mind of Christ. And the moment you see that, the need to improve dissolves. You may notice at first a fear arising. If I stop trying to improve, will I become careless? Will I lose direction? Will my life fall apart? But this fear comes from the same false assumption that you have been holding life together. The truth is simpler and far more reassuring. Life has been sustaining you despite your efforts, not because of them. Jesus did not say, improve yourself spiritually. He said, follow me. And following, in its deepest sense, means allowing divine consciousness to lead, to act, to express. When Paul said, I am crucified with Christ, he was not speaking of suffering, but of surrender, the end of personal authorship. Yielding is not a one-time event. It is a gentle, ongoing consent. Again and again, the personal self attempts to reassert control. And again, we release it not with force, but with awareness. We notice the tension, and we let it go. We notice the effort, and we rest. We notice the fear, and we remember, the Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. This yielding does not make you less effective in the world. It makes you more transparent to divine intelligence. Action still occurs. Decisions are still made. Words are still spoken. But they arise from a deeper source. They are no longer forced. They are inspired. It is not ye that speak, but the Spirit of your Father which speaketh in you. Here we must be careful not to turn surrender into another technique. You cannot practice yielding. You can only stop resisting. And resistance often appears in subtle forms: self-criticism, anxiety about outcomes, the need to understand everything before trusting, Yielding begins when we let go of the demand to know how God will manage our lives. There is a sacred humility in this, not the humility that says I am unworthy, but the humility that says I am not the source. And this humility opens the door to peace, a peace that does not depend on circumstances, a peace that passes understanding. My peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth, give I unto you. As yielding deepens, you may find that many questions lose their urgency, not because they are answered, but because they no longer matter. Life begins to feel carried rather than driven, supported rather than managed. And in that feeling, the Christ within is no longer an idea, it is an experience of rest. Now, having seen that surrender replaces improvement, we are ready to release yet another subtle attachment, the belief that spiritual practices themselves are the source of truth. And so we move naturally and quietly into the next unfolding. At a certain depth of spiritual unfoldment, even the most sacred practices must be released not because they were wrong, but because they have completed their purpose. Practices prepare the ground, recognition reveals the fruit, and when the fruit appears, the labor that prepared the soil naturally ceases. In the beginning, techniques are helpful. They steady the thought. They turn the attention inward. They loosen the grip of the outer world. But if we are not watchful, we begin to rely on the practice itself. We come to believe that peace comes from meditation, that healing comes from prayer, that guidance comes from technique. And this, too, is a subtle form of separation. Truth does not come from what you do. Truth is revealed when what is false is no longer believed. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Not the practice, not the effort, the truth. Recognition is not a method. It is an awakening. It is the quiet, unmistakable knowing that God is present, active, and complete here and now. When recognition dawns, there is no sense of accomplishment, no sense of I have done something. There is only a deep simplicity, as though something obvious has finally been noticed. This is why recognition cannot be practiced. You cannot rehearse it. You cannot force it. You cannot repeat it into being. It arrives when the mind stops demanding results, when the soul stops waiting for something to happen, when the heart rests in the awareness. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. Many are disappointed at this stage because they expect fireworks. They expect visions, sensations, emotional surges. But recognition is often quiet. It feels like relief, like laying down a heavy burden you did not know you were carrying. It is the end of seeking, not the climax of seeking. When recognition replaces practice, prayer changes once more. You may still sit in silence. You may still turn inward, but now there is no agenda, no hope that something will occur, no attempt to contact God. There is only the awareness that contact has never been broken. And in that awareness, the mind grows still of its own accord. This is why the most powerful prayer is often the simplest acknowledgement, Father, not followed by words, not followed by requests, just recognition, just presence, just being aware of being. I am that I am. At this point, even affirmations fall away, not because they were false, but because truth no longer needs to be asserted. When you know the sun is shining, you do not affirm light, you open your eyes. Recognition opens the inner eye, and when that eye is open, the need to repeat truth disappears. This does not mean that life becomes passive or vague. On the contrary, life becomes more exact, more precise, more orderly. But the order is not imposed. It unfolds. Decisions arise without strain. Right action presents itself without planning. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Notice, acknowledge, not manipulate. Recognition is the doorway through which grace flows unobstructed, and grace does not hurry. Grace does not strive. Grace does not prove. Grace is. When we stop leaning on methods, we discover that God has been doing the work all along. And so, very gently, very quietly, the student discovers that the practice was never the power. God was the power. The Christ within was the power. And the only thing that ever blocked that power was the belief that something else was needed. Now, having released technique, practice, and method, the soul naturally settles into a deeper stillness, not as an exercise, but as its native state. And it is to this stillness that we now turn when all effort has softened, when improvement has yielded to surrender, and when practice has given way to recognition. What remains is stillness, not a stillness you create, but a stillness that reveals itself as the natural state of being. This stillness is not silence in the outer sense. It is the absence of inner argument. It is the end of resistance. It is consciousness resting in itself. We have often believed that stillness must be achieved through discipline, posture, breath, or time. But stillness is not produced. It is uncovered. It appears when the mind stops asking questions of God and begins to listen. Be still and know that I am God. Not think about, not reason toward, know. In this stillness, there is no waiting for God to speak. The stillness itself is the language of God. Revelation does not come into stillness. Revelation is stillness made conscious. And when the soul enters this quiet, there is a subtle assurance, an unmistakable sense that nothing is required, nothing is lacking, nothing is out of order. Many are surprised to discover that guidance often comes not as words, but as clarity, not as direction, but as peace. Not as answers, but as the disappearance of the question. My sheep hear my voice, and that voice is not sound, it is certainty. Stillness is not something we visit and leave. It is the atmosphere in which spiritual understanding lives. When you find yourself straining, questioning, or fearing, it is not because truth has withdrawn, it is because stillness has been disturbed by thought. And the return to stillness is not an effort, it is a letting go. This is why Jesus so often withdrew, not to escape the world, but to rest in the source of all action. He did not seek stillness to gain power. He rested in stillness because power was already present. And from that stillness, he moved into the world with authority that did not argue, defend, or explain. He taught as one having authority. As stillness becomes familiar, you may notice a change in your relationship to life. Circumstances no longer dominate awareness. Problems lose their urgency. Even success and failure take on less importance. This is not indifference. It is perspective. It is seeing from the center rather than reacting from the surface. In stillness, the sense of me begins to dissolve, not dramatically, not emotionally, but naturally. You discover that life is happening, and you are not forcing it. Breathing occurs, thinking occurs, action occurs, and yet there is a quiet awareness behind it all, untouched and unthreatened. Underneath are the everlasting arms. This stillness does not remove you from daily life. It accompanies you into it. You may be active, engaged, responsible, and yet inwardly still. This is the Sabbath that Scripture speaks of. Not a day, but a state. There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. And in this rest, revelation continues not as information, but as unfoldment. Truth does not rush. It reveals itself as consciousness is able to receive it. You may not even realize that understanding has deepened until you notice that fear no longer arises where it once did, or that peace remains where it once fled. Now, from this stillness, a new way of living becomes possible, no longer consulting Christ as something outside, but living from Christ as the very substance of being. At this stage of unfoldment, a subtle but profound shift takes place, one that forever changes the way we relate to God. We move from consulting Christ to living from Christ. This may seem like a small distinction, but it marks the difference between duality and unity. To consult Christ is to assume separation. It implies that Christ is somewhere else, wiser than we are, and that we must ask, wait, and receive direction. And while this may appear reverent, it still preserves the sense of a personal self standing apart from divine intelligence. But to live from Christ is to recognize that the intelligence you seek is the intelligence that is functioning as your awareness. The Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works. When you live from Christ, you do not ask, what should I do, in anxiety. You rest in the awareness that right action will reveal itself, and it does not always dramatically, not always immediately, but always appropriately. The need to constantly seek guidance diminishes, because guidance becomes natural. As many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. This does not mean that you never pause or listen. It means that listening is no longer an activity, it is a state. Life itself becomes prayer. Awareness itself becomes communion. You find that decisions are made without strain, words are spoken without rehearsal, and actions arise without inner conflict. The human sense of self wants assurance in advance. It wants signs, confirmations, guarantees. But Christ consciousness does not move by prediction, it moves by presence. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. Truth is always revealed now, never ahead of time. Living from Christ also ends the habit of self-correction. You no longer monitor yourself spiritually. You no longer ask, am I being spiritual enough? That question belongs to the ego. Christ consciousness has no interest in measuring itself. It simply expresses, this is why Jesus never explained himself. He did not defend his authority. He did not justify his actions. He did not seek approval. He spoke and acted from certainty, not confidence. Confidence belongs to the human mind. Certainty belongs to divine awareness. As this way of living deepens, fear begins to lose its foundation. Fear depends on the belief that life is personal and vulnerable. But when life is recognized as divine activity, fear has nowhere to stand. Perfect love casteth out fear, not by effort, but by presence. Now we must address another burden that quietly dissolves when one lives from Christ, the burden of self-judgment. One of the most liberating effects of living from Christ is the quiet ending of self-judgment. Judgment has many disguises. It may appear as self-criticism, comparison with others, spiritual insecurity, or the feeling that one is always behind, late, or lacking. But all judgment, whether directed at oneself or another, rests on a single false premise, that there are separate selves, each with differing measures of worth, progress, or favor. Christ consciousness knows nothing of comparison. God does not measure. God does not rank. God does not improve. Judge not, that ye be not judged was never a moral instruction. It was a statement of spiritual law. The moment judgment appears, consciousness has shifted away from unity into separation. When identity is no longer personal, the need to evaluate oneself disappears. There is no longer a me trying to reach a standard. There is only divine life expressing itself as it will. And this expression does not compete. It unfolds. This is why guilt fades naturally in spiritual realization, not because mistakes are justified, but because identity is no longer rooted in behavior. The Christ is not improved by good actions, nor diminished by errors. There is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus, not because they are perfect, but because they are no longer living from a personal sense of self. And as self-judgment ends, judgment of others dissolves as well. You begin to see people not as problems to be fixed, but as expressions of the same life you are discovering within yourself. Compassion replaces analysis. Understanding replaces reaction. And forgiveness ceases to be an effort. It becomes natural. Now let us be clear. The end of effort does not mean the end of transformation. Change continues, but it occurs without struggle. This is one of the great surprises of spiritual awakening. Life reorganizes itself without being forced. Habits fall away that no longer belong. Relationships adjust. Priorities realign. Not because you have decided to change, but because Christ consciousness does not sustain what is not in harmony with it. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. And yet there is no violence in this passing away. It is gentle, orderly, natural. You may look back one day and realize that fears which once dominated you no longer arise. Situations that once provoked anxiety no longer disturb your peace. And you will not be able to point to a method that accomplished this. You will simply know that consciousness has shifted. This is divine transformation, change without conflict, growth without strain, healing without manipulation. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Truth does not exhaust. Only illusion does. Christ consciousness is not reserved for meditation or prayer. It expresses itself in ordinary life, in work, in relationships, in decisions, in silence, and in speech. There is no division between the sacred and the secular when life is lived from within. Money, health, and daily responsibilities cease to be spiritual obstacles. They become arenas in which divine order reveals itself. Supply is no longer something to be obtained, but something to be recognized. Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. This does not make life dramatic. It makes it steady. You become less impressed by appearances, less shaken by circumstances, less driven by outcomes. And yet you are more effective, more present, more responsive. Life feels lived rather than managed. And now we return quietly to where we began, to the weary seeker, to the one who has been striving, improving, practicing, and trying to arrive. We return not with a solution, but with a recognition. You were never meant to become Christ-aware through effort. You were never meant to reach God through discipline. You were never meant to improve yourself into spiritual being. That which is born of the Spirit is spirit. It has always been so. The Christ within you is not awakening, it is being acknowledged. The presence you seek has never been absent. The peace you long for has never been withheld. The life you desire to live has already been living you. So we end not with instruction, but with rest. Not with a call to action, but with a release. Let the effort fall away. Let the struggle dissolve. Let the mind grow quiet. And in that quiet, allow the simple truth to stand revealed. You are not on the way to Christ. You are resting in Christ.